Dave Pensado, one of the most renowned mixing engineers in the world in our generation, he has mixed for the likes of Michael Jackson, Mariah Carey, Lionel Richie, Beyonce, and many more. He once said in a famous quote that even up to now, in his old age, he is still learning compression. This shows you that compression is one of the most important tools in the world of audio mixing. And so this topic is very important as you learn to grow in your mixing career. But before you can master the most complex areas of compression, it's good to get the basics. And that's why we're here. And so at the end of this video, make sure you comment and you tell us what you would have learned about compression. And in case of any question, just drop it in the comments down below. A compressor is a signal processor that reduces the dynamic range of a signal. And right there in that definition, I've just said another difficult term, dynamic range. So what is a dynamic range? The dynamic range is the difference between the loudest and the quietest sounds that a signal can produce. So it's the difference between the loudest part, or the loudest a sound can become, and the quiet part, or the most calm, the most quiet a signal can become. The difference between those two is called the dynamic range. Sometimes it is good to have a different perspective of a concept in order to understand it better. So imagine you're watching a movie, and in the movie there are moments of calm, peace, unity, togetherness, and then suddenly in the movie there's action, noise, and the mood is very different all of a sudden. That is a dynamic range. That switching from intimate to action-packed is a change in dynamics. So putting that into our context, we're just talking about the dynamic range of a signal. I hope that helps. For us to fully understand all the necessary terms and properties of a compressor, we need to understand how it works. We need to learn how a compressor works. So how does a compressor work? A compressor works by comparing the input signal to a threshold. There you go, that's term number one that we're going to have to understand. What is a threshold? But before that, we need to still understand how a compressor works. If the input signal exceeds the threshold, the compressor will then reduce the amplitude of the signal in relation to a defined attack and release. Two terms that we need to know right there. And then the amount of reduction is determined by a compression ratio. That's the term number 4 that we also need to understand. Let's directly tackle the first term, threshold. What is a threshold of a compressor? The threshold of a compressor is the level at which the compressor starts compressing your audio signal. That means that any parts of your signal that are higher than the threshold will be reduced. Any part that is lower, that is quieter than the threshold, will not be compressed. In order for the compressor to do this, the compressor reads dB levels. It measures the dB level. It measures the loudness of the signal, because every signal at any point in time has a certain level, has a certain measure to it, and usually it's in dBs. And so the compressor compares the dB of the signal to the one of the threshold. And if the signal is above or below, the compressor will take the necessary action. If it is above, it will reduce the signal. If it's below, it will leave the signal uncompressed. Let's talk a bit about dB levels. We're not going to go much into the whole concept. You'll learn more about it in the course. But it is important for you to understand that in the normal world, normal music world, we live in the 16-bit standard. The 16-bit standard determines that the dB levels in the world of music and audio signals range from 0 to 96. Or other people go from minus 96 to 0. It's the same thing. So in this standard that we're working on, which determines the range of dB levels from 0 to 96, or minus 96 to 0. And so, tying in that with the compressor, that means the threshold is set to one of those numbers. and then compares the signal, compares the measure, compares the level of the signal to the number that is set. And then will act accordingly to what it finds. Let's get a bit practical. I'm now in Mixcraft and we're gonna try to demonstrate how the threshold works. Before me, I have two compressors. The one on my right will just help us to see the signal level, but the one we're gonna use is the one on my left. And we're going to take an interest in the threshold right here, the threshold. As we've said before, any signal that's above the threshold will be reduced. And we're just gonna demonstrate that right now. Take a look as I begin to reduce the threshold. As you can see, the lower I bring the threshold, the more quieter it becomes. But that's not all. Have a look at the compressor that's showing the signal. If you observe well, you will notice that the signal is proportional to where the threshold is. My signal is right here, and my threshold is like almost the same place. That means truly all the signals going above this threshold are being reduced. I can even go further. The further I go down, you can see the signal here is matching exactly where my threshold is. And that's a very simple representation of how a threshold works. Before we continue, I just want to invite you to like and subscribe. It really goes a long way in helping the channel. And if you really want to support us, you can buy our comprehensive course book using the link down below. Also available is an audiobook. This will help us to continue making quality videos for you all. Let's get back to the lesson. Now let's tackle attack and release. The attack time in a compressor determines how quickly the compressor reacts to a signal exceeding the threshold, while the release time determines how quickly the compressor stops compressing after the signal falls below the threshold. And so the attack basically is telling the compressor, okay, the signal is now above you, start compressing in X amount of time. While the release tells you, oh, the signal is now below you, okay, release the compression, stop compressing after X amount of time. Let's get practical. I'm back in Mixcraft and we are going to try to demonstrate the attack and the release. We've said before that when an attack is set very fast, the compressor compresses almost immediately according to the fast attack. But the more slower the attack, the compressor will be forced to wait a bit before beginning the compression. And we're going to demonstrate that. I've set this compressor to be very aggressive, and when it starts compressing, to completely cut the signal. When I'm going to press play, because I'm going to set the attack very fast, there will be literally no sound coming through. Check that out. So I'm going to press play. First of all, I set my attack. Let's set our attack here. This is the fastest that this compressor can do. That's 0.01. Now, when I press play, you're going to notice that there's literally no sound coming through. And you can check right here. You can check right here on this compressor here. Let's press play. There you go. Not a single sound. Not a single sound can be heard because the compressor is very, very fast. Now, let's reduce the attack to the slowest possible. For this compressor, that's around 1,000. When I press play, because the compressor is slower, there will be a signal that will pass because we've allowed it to pass until a certain point in time. So let's press play. There you go. Let's again try. So you can see, because my attack is very slow, the signal has permission to pass through for a certain period of time before the compressor kicks in. The release is now the contrary. It's just the contrary. If you've understood the attack, the release, just get the release as the contrary of the attack. Later on in the course, we will talk about the different uses of attack and release and where you can actually use them, how, what time is best for what kind of genre, what kind of instrument, and all of that. We'll talk about that later on in the course. And so to encourage you to keep on participating in this course, and surely in the future there, as we continue, you will learn how to use attack and release. But right now it's important to know how they work. What is the ratio? The ratio in audio compression determines how much gain reduction is applied to a signal when it exceeds the threshold. Now, ratios are a bit mathematical. A ratio of 1:1 just means that no gain reduction is applied. But a ratio of 10:1 means that for every 10 dB of gain above the threshold, the compressor will reduce the gain by 1 dB. Dealing with ratios is a bit of a mathematical thing. Not so much, but at least we need to have some kind of knowledge into it. It's a bit like odds. So if I say I'm putting a ratio of 1:1, for example, this means there's no compression. No compression happening right here, okay? But let's say, for example, I have a ratio of 10:1. In this type of compression, that means for every 10 dB above the threshold, reduce 1 dB. For every 10 dB that is above the threshold, reduce 1 dB. All right, let's say, for example, we have a ratio of 4:2. Going with the same analogy that we had here, that would mean that for every 4 dB that's above the threshold, reduce how many? You can see the analogy right there. Reduce how many? 2. That means in this case, we're going to reduce 2. We're back in Mixcraft. I want to try to determine how the ratio works according to the calculations that we just did before. I have before me 2 signals right here. The first signal, I've set it to the threshold. That means when I play my signal, almost nothing is happening. You can see here on as you can see here on this compressor, almost nothing is happening. But my second signal has been set plus 10 dB. Right here, I've added 10 dB on this signal. That means that the second signal is 10 dB higher than the threshold. Now, our question is, what will happen to that signal if we set a ratio of 2:1? What will happen to that signal if we set a ratio of 2:1? All right, according to our calculations, when the signal goes 10 dB louder with a threshold of 2:1, we should have at least 5 dB of compression. Let's check it out. That's the normal signal. Nothing is happening for now. And then as it approaches 10 dB, let's go. There we go, 10 dB. What is happening? As you can see here, the compression is about 4.8, and we had said 5. And so 4.8, that's almost 5. And because of the nature of signals, of waves, it's not really a constant, but the amount is close to our calculations. Let's look at the type of compressors that normally used in the audio world. Now, there are many, but we're not going to mention all of them. The ones that I need you to know as kind of sound engineers at the very least. So we have linear compressors. What are linear compressors? Linear compressors are compressors that reduce the amplitude of the signal by a constant amount. So the ratio is pretty much fixed in this case. most of the time. Second, we have non-linear compressors. Non-linear compressors reduce the amplitude by variation depending on the input. So it depends for non-linear compressors. And then the third one that we're going to talk about is limiters. Okay, a limiter is a compressor with simply a very high ratio. A very high ratio. And are mostly used in mastering at the end of the mix bus, not to saturate the mix. Now, I know I've just said a lot right there, but don't worry. If you keep on in this course, you're going to understand all those concepts. All right, let's have a small recap. A compressor is a powerful tool that is used to improve the mixes by reducing the audio signal that is above a certain point. It is used basically to control what we call dynamic range. So the compressor is basically a dynamic processor. Okay? We've also learned about very important terms and properties of a compressor. We talked about the threshold, we talked about the attack, we talked about the release and the ratio. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you again in the next lesson.